Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Okay.
How are you doing? How's everyone doing? Everyone here is good? Alhamdulillah. I know this is past my bedtime, but we are here for a fireside chat. Even though there's no fire, I was expecting like a nice fireplace or something, you know?
We should get one of those fake ones.
Yep, yep. So, effects, anyone please get us a fire going? Alhamdulillah, first of all, like we are so honored to have you here. So on behalf of Mac, thank you for joining us and taking time. I know your schedule is really busy, especially being a mom now.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And honestly, I'm not used to being in the hot seat, and I haven't been behind a microphone for a year, as you mentioned. I'm on maternity leave. And so I'm excited. I am a little bit nervous, though.
It's a very cold seat. Don't worry, it's nothing hot about it. It's okay. Like, no need to, mashallah. So let's just get right into it. So as you all heard, mashallah, Ginella is, really, she made history a couple years ago when she became the first hijab-wearing woman in Canada in 2015. And so why don't you give us the spiel and kind of why you got into journalism, and first how, and maybe why specifically that?
Yeah, one of the stories that I always tell is about being in elementary school and always getting that comment on my report card. Janella's a good student, but she talks too much when she's not supposed to. So that's how it started when I was, in the third grade. I remember I entered a speech competition, and that was the first time I kind of put all that talking to good use and realized that I was talking and people were actually listening, and I could say something in an interesting way and compel an audience. And, I was always involved in the school plays and the speech competitions and all of that. And I think my mom was afraid I was going to tell her I wanted to be an actor or something. And I think she gently tried to push me in the direction of something a little bit more respectable and said, maybe you should go into like broadcasting or hosting a show like Oprah or something like that. And so that kind of was the seed that sparked that. But for a while I thought, I'd never seen anyone who looked like me hosting a show on TV, and I thought, well, maybe I'll go into radio. Then it doesn't matter what I look like, it'll just be my voice. And, my parents would say, no, don't, change your dreams. Just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean you can't do it. So, it started from quite young.
MashaAllah. Well, kudos to your mom, mashallah. Mothers always know best, right? She knew that, she was sitting on a gem, and so alhamdulillah that, that went on. In hindsight, kind of looking now, years from when we were, in elementary and whatnot, I'm not going to ask you what is the one key you feel is the success, because I feel like it's always hard. Like there's not this one magical thing. It's just, a bunch of little, pokes all around. So what do you think is, the most important thing maybe that led to your success, and maybe all the other little things too?
Of course, as you say, so many different things, working hard and all of that. But I do think that the key was persistence. And it's something I often tell young people, it's not always the most talented person who gets the job who succeeds. It's the one who's the most persistent and has the most guts or has the most connections. Can be that too. I didn't have connections, so I had to rely on knocking on a lot of doors and not taking no for an answer. I remember my first on-air job, I applied for that job 3 different times over the course of 2 years. And they rejected me multiple times. And every time they rejected me, I would ask them for feedback. And they would give me some feedback. Oh, you just need some shooting experience, or, or work on your demo a little bit more. And I'd go and I'd do whatever they asked, and I'd come back and I'd apply it again. And then, again, they said, oh, we went with somebody internally. And then by the 3rd time, either they got tired of saying no to me, or they realized that, I wasn't going to go away very easily, or they saw that I had something, and they decided to give me a chance. So I do think that persistence is key.
For sure. So how do you get back up? Because it's actually really hard. You make it sound easy, like, I just kept knocking on the door. It's really hard. When someone shuts the door in your face, it takes a lot. First, if you don't have the support system, which, mashallah, it sounded like you did, but still internally, how do you actually find it within you to get back up and feel like, imposter syndrome, right? We're all feeling this all the time. What is it really that kind of kept you knocking again and again?
It was just a dream that I really felt like I could be good at if I was just given the opportunity. That's all I needed. I just needed a chance. And so I knew a lot of times that the no wasn't actually because I wasn't skilled, or the no wasn't actually because I wasn't the best for the job. There was kind of this elephant in the room that I often had to be the one to address and say, look, I know you've never hired anyone who looks like me. Look, I know you might have some questions or apprehensions or maybe assumptions about what it might mean to hire somebody like me.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
What are your concerns? What are you worried about? And let me help you overcome them,
For sure.
right? So I think that was part of it too, was feeling like I just wanted to be given a chance to succeed. And so, just put me on and then we'll go from there.
You'll see, I'm awesome.
You'll see.
Just like, yeah, for sure. But I remember once you saying too that you, when you didn't get a job, you went back and so it's not like, oh, you didn't do anything and just reapplied to the same job. You actually honed some skills some more. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How?
So basically, the first time they said, I didn't get the job, they said I needed more shooting experience. It was a video journalist position. And so I was volunteering at Rogers TV, and I went back and I said, I need to get shooting experience. Can you let me, send me out? And they said, okay, sure. So I worked on my demo, and I was interning at the time as well. So that was the other thing, is that I had kind of gotten a taste of it. I was working as an intern. I was working behind the scenes. I was on air at Rogers TV, volunteer. I wasn't paid. And so I'd gotten bitten by this bug that I was like, I have to pursue this. And so what is it going to take? Tell us, if it's no today, what's it going to take to say yes tomorrow?
For sure.
And I'm going to go and do that.
For sure. No, mashallah, it's that persistence, that grit, which now we know is the secret really to success, right? It's not just talent and skill, but having that grit and getting up and knocking on the door over and over again. So I remember in 2021, the Canadian Association of Journalists, they published basically a report that talked about the breakdown of newsrooms and what they actually looked like. I remember when I was at the Star for a short time, I remember going into the newsroom and they were all white, right? And I remember looking around, I'm like, there was one, we all know Noor Javed, mashallah, a very renowned Toronto Star author and journalist. I remember seeing her in hijab, and I'm like, okay, at least there's one other, right? But you could literally count the minorities on your hand. And I think the report said 75% of all newsrooms across Canada, on average, were white. 10% were Asian, and then the rest were basically Black, Hispanic, I think 2% was Middle Eastern, and some mixed race. And obviously this was really disappointing. I'm not surprised, but it was disappointing at the time because and we know this, Toronto, if you just walk outside, it's definitely not a monolithic culture. There's so much diversity, but the newsroom doesn't reflect that. So can you talk a little bit about that? Let's start with that and then we'll take it from there.
I'll tell you, it was shocking to me. It was shocking to me, having grown up in Toronto, the most multicultural city in the world. I went to school in Scarborough. I certainly wasn't the only girl in hijab. There was so many different cultures and languages represented in my high school. And so then I walked into this internship in the biggest local newsroom in the country, and it did not look like the Toronto that I knew, as you said. I could count the people of color on my hand. The only other woman, I worked in a building with 3,000 people. If you know the CTV building in Scarborough, outside, just across from the Scarborough Town Centre, I worked in that building. In a building of 3,000 people, the only other woman in hijab that I ever ran into was the woman who worked in the cafeteria. So that was really, for me, the first time I felt like an other. I felt like a foreigner. I felt like an outsider. And more, even on top of that, was the feeling that, okay, these are university educated people who are, doing an important job and they are cultured. And I was shocked by the questions that they had for me, by the things that they didn't know, the very basic things. I thought, how do you live in Toronto and not know these things? I think for some of them, I was maybe the first Muslim that they knew personally, that they might have had an interaction with. And that was shocking to me. And that was also part of the reason I felt like I needed to be in the newsroom. I needed to be in this space. They need people who look like me. They need people who look like us, because it's their job to tell the stories of our communities, but they're not, because the newsroom is not reflective of the community. For sure. So there were times they would ask me questions and things like that, and I'd go, what would they do if I wasn't here? What would their headline look like? What would their coverage look like? Would this story even get attention? And so that was also part of that feeling of seeing a need to be in those spaces.
For sure. I remember a funny story. It's not really funny. It's a little embarrassing. Not for me, but I remember when I was an intern at CBC, walking past the building. So in all the languages, it says hello, bonjour, and and all that. In Arabic, it says al-lugha al-arabiyya, which basically says Arabic. So literally on my first day as an intern, I'm like, can we get that fixed? I don't know if they did. I need to go walk past. I don't think they did. But I'm like, guys, you realize this is a little embarrassing. Like, it says Arabic. It doesn't even say assalamu alaikum or marhaban or anything.
I'll tell you a secret. There is a similar mistake on the intro to my show.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
So
someone flagged it.
Absolutely. And it's not just like we just want to feel included. As you were saying, like, the importance of having diversity in, the management or people inside the newsroom. When it's not about, like, what story are we going to tell today to entertain people? It's literally the people inside those rooms are the people that inform us of our reality, really.
I remember specifically, actually, at that time, it was the first time around that the religious symbols ban was kind of being floated. And I remember one of my managers basically asking me to explain, like, is this a big deal? And I had to say to him, listen, if you ask me to come to work without my hijab, that's like asking me to come to work without pants on, right? I'm gonna have to make a choice about my morality, and I'm probably not gonna choose my job.
For sure.
Right? And so this is a big deal, and this is a big story, and it should be treated accordingly.
100%. Speaking of big stories, I remember during the London attack a few years ago, I remember watching the night segment on Canada Tonight, and it was a really heavy night for all of us. It kind of came out of nowhere, and like we're so used to seeing kind of Islamophobia elsewhere, or like really, there's a lot of microaggressions that happen, micro-Islamophobia that we find. But this was really one of the biggest, like, aside from the Quebec shooting and, And subhanAllah, I remember seeing you and all the guests on that show that evening were like, every, interview with another Muslim. You had NCCM, you had different people from, London. And I remember thinking, they just got the news. They themselves are processing what's going on. That in itself was traumatizing to all of us. So how did you manage kind of that feeling of what just happened? I'm still trying to figure it out, my own safety, my family, what is this? This is my country. And then you have your professional hat on, like, okay, I'm actually fine, but I'm not. Like, so how do you actually balance that?
I don't think I even really processed what had happened until after I got off the air. Because, so actually I'll share with you that day, I wasn't supposed to be working that day. Someone had called in sick and they'd asked me to come in early. And subhanAllah, honestly, everything is by Allah's will, because I was prepping for the show. We were an hour to air, and we got word there's going to be a press conference at 3 o'clock, and police are going to announce that this hit and run that happened on the weekend, this family that was killed, that it was a hate-motivated attack, and the family was Muslim. So we were told right before it happened. So we were actually given an hour to prep and book all of those guests. And so, as a Muslim, that news is incredibly shocking and jarring and upsetting and horrifying. As a journalist, I didn't even have time to process any of those feelings. I had to put my journalism hat on and go into breaking news mode. And as you said, I get on air, and I didn't book the guests. My chase producers did, and I get on air, and they say, okay, here's who they're talking to, and I look at the list, and I see, as you say, that they were all Muslim. And as you say, I realized that they're all just processing this news like it's just come out, and then we're literally talking to them right after. And I felt the same way that you said, that they're going through something and they're processing this with everyone live on TV. And so I actually felt some comfort in the fact that I was the one who was facilitating that conversation, because I was also processing it. And I remember speaking to the imam, and he was the last guest that I had on, and I said to him, the last question I said to him, I said, can you just share some words of comfort? And that question was for me. That question was for us, for the Muslim public that was watching. And yeah, I got off the air, and I remember texting my husband, like, are you watching this? This is so crazy. And then finally I started thinking about, we'd just done that. We'd just gone on a walk on the weekend. It was during COVID. Everybody was doing their mental health walks, remember? And, and I remember feeling sad, so sad for the young boy who'd lost his family, angry at, is this what it's come to? We are just walking down the street. We are a threat. And I had so many feelings. And a couple days later, they asked me to co-host the vigil. And again, I was feeling very emotional going into that show. And I was watching the coverage all day, and I was hearing all these politicians saying all these flowery things about how hate has no place in our country, and I was getting angry. I was getting angry watching all of that. And I kept thinking about, I'm doing this show, I'm one of the pillars of journalism is that you're supposed to be objective, that you're not supposed to insert yourself into the story. But at the same time, I kept thinking, well, why did they ask me to co-host it? If not to offer some context and some experience, some lived experience.
For sure.
And so I knew going in that, I had all these thoughts and feelings, but how can I share them and make sure that I stick to my obligation as a journalist? But how do I also represent my community? I have a platform here. And what's the point of me being here if I'm not going to use it and in a meaningful way? So, we went to air, and I told myself, just stick to the facts. Just stick to the facts. You can't get in trouble for giving your opinion if you just state facts. And so I stated facts that, these politicians were saying hate has no place in Canada, and yet a third of them had voted against M103, which is a motion to condemn Islamophobia. It was a non-binding motion. It didn't even require them to do anything other than make a statement against Islamophobia. The fact that, this wasn't a one-off. We'd had a mosque shooting 4 years beforehand. That we lived in a country where there was a province where you couldn't work in certain jobs if you wore hijab. And I started saying all of these things, and frankly, my heart was beating out of my chest because I wasn't sure if I was going to get hauled into the principal's office afterwards. But I had to say that because it was true, and I knew that if I was feeling this way, then Canadian Muslims were feeling this way.
I remember watching it, and I remember, thank God she said that.
And
you humanized it.
And that was just it. I thought, what, even if I do get in trouble, it's okay, because my phone started buzzing right after, and people started sending me messages. Thank you so much for saying that. Thank you so much. And thankfully, I didn't get in trouble. I had a conversation with my bosses, and in the end, they said, our coverage was better because you were there, and this is part of the reason we brought you here. But the network did get complaints, and I had to deal with ombudsman complaints. But in the end, the ombudsman ruled that I was not in violation of any journalistic standards, and that a journalist's lived experience is valuable context, and that what I was offering that evening was analysis and context that just happened to come from the form of my lived experience. So for me, that was also an important and a proud moment for me, because I was kind of forcing the public broadcaster to take a stance in this way and to publicly say that this makes our journalism better.
For sure.
And so for all of the, the horrific parts of that, and having to go through that in not just a professional setting, but as a Muslim, being in that space, I'm thankful for the little bit of, I don't know if I want to say good, but for the little bit that came out of it.
And round of applause, absolutely. And mashallah. And you wonder if the same rules apply to everyone, right?
They don't.
You don't wonder, So kind of speaking on that, how did you deal with this pressure of being, I remember being in the newsroom when the Paris attacks happened. And I remember one piece of advice that the editor used to always tell me, you're writing, the articles could use more, a more subjective sense. I was like, no, we were taught we were supposed to be objective. So I was so, I remember writing an article that time about the Paris attacks. She's like, there you go, there's your voice. I was like, but yeah, it was an op-ed. It was supposed to be my voice. So it was really confusing. But I remember the first, I think, sentence I had in that was, I felt like the spokesperson for everyone, even though I was just there literally for months. You were there, mashallah, for years. So how did you deal with this pressure that you were not just, the walking, talking Islam, you were the Islam that they knew, and everyone was watching you, and your many hats, your Afro-Latina Muslim woman hat. So that's a lot of hats to juggle, right? So how did you deal with this, exhaustion, really, but also a sense of responsibility and obligation? How did you balance that?
There's so much there. And the first thing that you said was important because, you get hired and you're celebrated as bringing diversity in the newsroom. But at the same time, there's this feeling that, well, don't bring too much of yourself into the newsroom. You have to be objective. And it's like, well, which is it? You know, we want you to be here because you're Muslim, but we don't want you to talk too much about being Muslim.
We just want to check a box.
There is that feeling often in many newsrooms, and that's frustrating. As for the pressure and the obligation, I certainly felt it every day. And not just in this role, in many of my roles, because I often was the only one who looked like me in the newsroom. So I often felt like, okay, here I am, the spokesperson for 1 million Muslims in Canada, 1 billion Muslims in the world. And I, you know, you have to remind yourself that you can't fight every fight. I had to remind myself that. And I had to give myself some grace, because otherwise I'd burn out and I wouldn't last. And so I learned to pick my battles. I learned also to call people in as opposed to calling them out, to talk to them from a place of, you know, camaraderie and friendship, and often from a place of business, right? Often businesses only do the right thing because it's going to cost them not to, not because it's the right thing to do. So if you approach it and say, hey, I really want to save you guys some embarrassment. Hey, I want to save you guys some backlash, or having to backtrack or rewrite this or make an apology, you know, and flagging these things. You're doing that from a business perspective, and that's also important. Sometimes you have to remove your emotion from it.
100%, 100%. Do you have examples of like times, like the first thing that comes to mind is, did anyone really ever just tell you like, oh my God, this is kind of weird, you're with hijab? Or is it like, you know, I don't think anyone's probably ever said it to your face. Like, it's always like, oh, then they go to the washroom, or, you know. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Canadians are very polite with their racism. So no one ever told me to my face, you're not going to be hired. They couldn't. That would be discriminatory.
Absolutely.
They could get in trouble, a human rights complaint. I did have a professor who didn't tell me, but told my colleague, my classmate, Ginella's, you know, she's really talented, but I'm worried she's going to have, you know, trouble with her hijab. You know, would you talk to her? Do you think she would ever consider removing it? And my friend was horrified, and she actually didn't. She was like, I'm not going to talk to her about that. Absolutely not. And she didn't tell me till like years later, after I was already on air. And you know,
just let her send him that.
Yeah, yeah. I had one producer who. I said, oh, they'll never put a woman in hijab on TV. It's too distracting. And he didn't know that I wanted to be on air. I was a producer at the time. And he kind of just said it in such a flippant way. And I just remember thinking, like, we'll see. But yeah, how many, I have stories and stories. I don't know how much time we have. But I would say the most challenging sort of job that I was ever in was as a producer at a talk radio station. So if you want to think about being the only in a newsroom, now be the only Muslim in a newsroom that's full of more right-leaning talk radio hosts, and many of whom had lots of opinions about Muslims, and I guarantee you that most of them probably had never had a conversation with a woman in hijab. And so here I was, sitting literally on the other side of the glass, looking at them while they were on air. And so every word that would come out of their mouth, you could see the wheels turning, like they would have to think twice about what they were about to say on air. And specifically, I remember there were many, many challenging moments where I had to bite my tongue and kind of just keep it rolling. But I remember this was around the time that ISIS was kind of gaining notoriety, especially in North America. And there was a journalist who was beheaded, and it was posted online, and it was a horrific video, and people were like, who are these crazy people? And he was like, you know, if Muslims say this isn't Islam, you know, why aren't they condemning them? And I said, well, have you ever invited a Muslim to come up and talk on your show? And he's like, well, you're Muslim, why don't you come and talk on the show? And I'm like, 23, like it's like my second job in the industry. I'm not a religious scholar. I'm not a Mideast expert. I'm just me, and I can only speak about my experience as a Muslim. And you know, I felt like this is so unfair to be put on the spot like 100%. This on live radio. But if not me, who else? If I wasn't here, he would just be going on. And so, you know, that was really scary, but also. Again, another moment that reminded me why I needed to be in this space, and also why more of us needed to be in these spaces, because it was very lonely. It was a very lonely place to be.
For sure.
And it's difficult to navigate when you don't have anyone that you can turn to and ask for advice.
For sure, for sure. But mashallah, I remember thinking like the ring of, Canada Tonight with Ginella Massa is much more impactful than Canada Tonight with Muhammad, right? Because why? Because you, in your hijab wearing, self, you present yourself with your full, and we were just talking earlier, I'm not going to call it identity, but your full self, right? This is who I am, and this is just unapologetic. And so there was so much power to that. And I think people, you didn't even have to tell them, oh, I stand firm in my beliefs. Like, they could just see that the moment they look at you. So, I mean, kind of keeping in with the theme of the event, how do you find it to stay true to yourself and your beliefs and not compromising on your values when literally everyone around you doesn't uphold these same beliefs, and when it isn't such a lonely place? It's easy to say, yeah, I uphold them when you're here, right, in a convention surrounded by Muslims, but when you're, out on the streets or, in your workplace where you're the only one, no one would know if you, took a drink or went to that bar or 1, 2, 3. No one would know if you. So how do you uphold those? And do you think it actually can lead to success or pull you back or hinder you? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, in talking about picking my battles, part of it was recognizing that me just being in that space and existing was a radical act in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So it's okay if I'm not, fighting every fight, because me just being in this space is like shaking things up on its own. And I think it comes down to intention. I honestly feel like Allah protected me a lot and opened a lot of doors for me in ways that, it was difficult, but I feel like it could have been even harder than it was. And I think it was because of my intention. I always saw my job as bigger than myself. I always thought about, why do I want to be here? Is it just to be famous? Is it to be on TV? It'd be very easy for me to just collect my paycheck and go home. But I felt an obligation, I felt a duty, I felt a responsibility as a woman in hijab in a public space. And I also, I'm not a perfect Muslim. There's so many things, that I'm still working on myself. And so I'm always trying to hold myself to this high standard, because I recognize for a lot of Canadians, this is their only interaction with a Muslim. Mm-hmm. This is their only time. This is their idea of what Muslims can do and what they can be. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about Islam, I'm not, preaching, but I am giving da'wah every night by just being on air, right?
Absolutely.
And so for me, trying to keep that intention has always kind of helped me in those moments where I, feel really down or I feel like I'm struggling. But, if I'm really honest, I know a lot of women struggle with hijab, and especially in the spotlight, and it can be very enticing to, blend into the crowd. Maybe that's just it, is I love to stand out. I don't like to be like everybody else, and they always remember me for that reason.
For sure.
But for me, honestly, I think having that intention has helped me. And in the moments where I'm really struggling, and I go home crying, upset, and feeling like they're either going to fire me or I'm going to quit, because one of these days. And my mom would always say to me, just remember, it's not them who gives and takes the job, it's Allah who does, and remembering that, right?
For sure. For sure.
That there's always other opportunities if this isn't the one for you, or if this is if it's time to step back, or they say see your way out. Allah will always protect you.
Absolutely. MashaAllah. Speaking of stepping back, so I don't know if you all know or not, but Ginella actually stepped back from her job recently. MashaAllah, she has, 9 months now?
10 months.
10 months, MashaAllah, daughter. So while she was on maternity leave, she made this decision. And I think, MashaAllah, when we all see you, you've reached the peak primetime evening TV. It's not the morning news that, people are like, 5 a.m. It's the 11 o'clock, So how was that? Making that decision. I'm not going to ask you about all the whys, because I know it's a very personal decision. But, given that you made this decision on maternity leave, I think a lot of women here can, know how much of an identity shift, motherhood is. And so how did becoming a mother, change your priorities possibly, or, alter your vision for life? Tell us a little bit about that decision.
Yeah. And to your point, there are so many different reasons why I decided to step back from daily news. And I think it would have happened even if I didn't become a mother. I think it just happened sooner because of it. Because you have this moment where you're really reevaluating your whole identity, your place in the world. You feel like nobody, and then at the same time, you're the most important thing. You're doing the most important job, and at the same time, you're like contributing nothing. And you just have this existential crisis.
All I'm doing is changing diapers. Why did I go to school for this?
Yeah. And so, it does make you start to also think about your contributions. It made me think about, the role model I want to be for my daughter. It made me think about, what I want to do with the time that I spend away from her. And I felt like I'd kind of done what I needed to do with Canada Tonight. And I was ready to make new goals. And I'm like a shark. I got to keep moving. And I'm always looking for the next thing. And so, yes, I'd reached this amazing goal. And I did it. And now I was ready for something else.
Next. Okay,
exactly, right? So the other big piece is feeling like, I had spent so much time navigating this industry on my own that I wanted to be the mentor that I didn't have. I want to be able to talk to young people about what they can expect when they come into these newsrooms, how they can not just survive, but thrive in them. And this is part of why I'm teaching at Ryerson. That was one of the things that I want to do more media consulting, more media training, more community engagement, so that there isn't just one of me. So that I'm not the only one or the last one, so that there are many of us in the newsroom, working together. And that's one of my goals. And I'm also working on a couple of my own projects. A lot of times having that title as first hijabi news anchor puts me in a very specific box about the type of work and journalism that I can do.
Yeah.
There are so many stories that I'm interested in telling that actually have nothing to do with being Muslim or being in hijab. And there are stories from the Muslim community that I want to tell. So I feel like, there are so many things that I want to do in the future, and that the industry as well is changing so quickly. Absolutely. It's moving forward, and I want to be a part of that change. I don't think we even know what it's going to look like in 3 years. 100%. And so, I'm excited about the opportunities.
Absolutely. So you spoke a little bit about, mentoring the younger generation. So what would you tell, anyone here, young or a little older than young, who want to pursue this career or are in a career and want to switch to this career? What's something that you would tell them about, whether, how to, whether it's getting your foot in the door or just general advice?
You have to do it because you love it. You have to do it because you want to tell stories, because you want to speak truth to power. You can't do it because you want to be famous or you want to be glamorous or you want to make lots of money. Because frankly, especially in traditional media right now, there is not a lot of money. It's a shrinking industry. There are a lot of cuts. And the schedule is terrible. I mean, I haven't been, that's the other thing. I haven't been home for dinner in like 5 years. Ask my poor husband. I think since we met, I worked nights, and so that's another thing to consider with my family as well.
Absolutely.
You have to do it because you love it, and that is what's going to give you the motivation to stay when it gets tough, because it is an important job, and we need our voices in these spaces.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, from the outside looking in, it's really easy, mashallah, to see all the success. And it's like when you mentioned, I was crying, and I was like, you cry? You went to the washroom and you did that? Really?
I had a rule, no crying at work, only in the parking lot.
Okay. Parking
That's
lot
the key to
doesn't
success.
So can you share with us like maybe a moment or two where you just were truly vulnerable and actually questioned yourself? Like this idea of imposter syndrome that we talked about, am I like, should I just leave? Or, what was that reset? And show us the behind the scenes of Ginella Massa.
I certainly question myself every day. I have imposter syndrome every day. I'm very good at fake it till you make it and don't let them see you sweat, which is why that's what you see on TV. But certainly there's a lot of, self-doubt, a lot of struggling behind the scenes. But I always felt like I couldn't let the cracks show because they've, I'm here. They've let me be here, and I can't expose myself, or to them, anyways, to the industry. And I would, have those private moments. But feeling like quitting or feeling like leaving, I don't see that as giving up, because I actually have quit a job before. And I don't see that as giving up. I see that as realizing that something wasn't serving me, and pivoting to the next thing that was going to serve me better, and that was going to allow me to do what I set out to do. So I don't think that there's any, I don't think you should feel bad about feeling like this is too much, I need to step back, this is too hard, because we shouldn't be struggling that hard every day in a place where you spend 1/3 of your life. So if you are feeling that way, it's okay to take a breath and to step back and to say, this is not for me. Let me find another way that I can reach my best potential, be my best self, and achieve the things that I set out to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Kind of going back to motherhood, and it's on my mind a lot because I feel like I did something kind of similar with, I took a break with my kids, and subhanAllah, how do you deal with that identity shift that you've built, you've worked so hard, years, your entire life for this goal, and not to say when you become a mother, all that goes to waste, absolutely not. Whether it's on pause or different seasons, and we know all the speeches about that. But what advice would you give to young mothers who are really struggling with that? Yeah.
I'm still working through that myself. I'm still working through all those emotions myself. I'm still, in some ways, mourning the loss of that Ginella that I've left behind, but also recognizing that it's paving the way for a new one.
Yeah.
And I also don't want people to see my departure as like, oh, you can't be a mother and have this high-powered job. That's not it at all. But I also feel like, it's a moment for me to see myself in a new light, to transform myself. And for me, I also, I'm thinking about who's the person that I want to be for my daughter, who's the person that I want her to look up to. So I'm still figuring out who this new person is. And as you said, I'm always going to be a journalist. And I don't need a title or a job or a network to validate that. That is a part of me, that is a part of my identity, that it will always be a part of me in whatever capacity I choose to use it.
Absolutely. Is there anything you want to share with us? Something that maybe not everyone else knows? Something,
She's trying to get the exclusive
the
scoop.
Fireside Chat part of the darkest, deepest secrets.
I feel like I've spilled so many secrets today already.
I love that you showed us your human side. I think especially when you're watching people on TV, it's so not robotic, but so perfect. You got the teleprompter, every camera, you know exactly where to look, and it's beautiful, and you need that obviously when you're, you got 1 minute or 2 minutes to get the story in and whatnot. But it's nice to see the human side of Ginella. So thank you for sharing that with us today. But I just before we wrap up, I'm just wondering, is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
I mean, I would say this. I would like to thank, the Canadian Muslim community for embracing me, for championing me, for cheering me on. I was really scared I was scared both times. I was scared when I was hired, that I was going to be criticized, held to a higher standard. As Muslims, as women rather, we're always scrutinized in a different way. How's our hijab? She's wearing too much makeup. She has this, that, and the other. And so I worried that, I wasn't a good enough Muslim role model for the Muslim public, but they've given me a lot of grace, and I know I'm not perfect, and I try to be the best that I can be and be the best role model that I can be. And on the other side of that, I was scared about announcing that I was leaving. I was scared that I was disappointing the Canadian Muslim community who, would tell me how great it was to see me, and they were so inspired, and my daughter looks up to you, and, it was so great to have you in this, this role. And now I was just flinging it behind. And I was pleasantly surprised by the reaction that most people said, congratulations for, making the right choice for you, and we're so excited to see what you do next. And so having that feeling that the community is behind me and whatever I decide to do next is really, really heartening.
MashaAllah. No, first of all, First of all, I think no one is perfect. And, we're all on this journey of self-improvement every single day. And I always tell myself, 2 is better than 0, 50 is better than 0. So you got started. And about leaving, when someone shovels the driveway for that one part, so everyone walks there, or just takes those footsteps. You try to step in those footsteps so you don't get your boot.
Yeah.
You walked in the snow for everyone. So for the
That's such a
future
great metaphor. I love
generation,
that.
right?
It's
So-
a very Canadian one.
right? It's a little chilly in this room, so I'm already thinking winter. But you stepped in the snow for us, and I think for the future generations who want to, get into this industry, which is a lot. People now, it's like, oh, we bet on her before and she didn't disappoint us. Let's give this person a try. So on behalf of the younger generation, we thank you for that, and thank you so much for your time today. And
Thank you. Thank you for your insightful questions and a great conversation.
It was great having a talk. This needs a hot chocolate, right? With the fire.
Fireside chat.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
everyone.